Martha Johnson pushed her cleaning cart slowly down the long, gleaming corridors of Glendale Industries. Her movements deliberate and careful. At 68 years old, each step carried the weight of decades of work, but also the quiet pride of someone who had spent her life contributing to a place that, for a long time, had felt like home. Yet, despite over 40 years of unwavering dedication, she often felt invisible, her presence acknowledged only when a spill needed cleaning or a mess demanded attention. She had long accepted this invisibility as part of her role, though it didn't make it any less painful. Martha wasn't just a janitor. She was the silent keeper of Glendale Industries' heartbeat, maintaining the order that allowed the company's more visible parts to function seamlessly. But beyond the polished tiles and spotless breakrooms, her life told a story of resilience and sacrifice. Widowed young and then struck by the loss of her only daughter 2 years prior, Martha had taken on the role of raising her 3 grandchildren. It was not the retirement she had imagined, but one she embraced out of love and necessity. That love was the anchor that kept her going, even as her body protested with each movement. The ache in her back, the stiffness in her joints, these were mere distractions compared to the weight of her responsibilities. Every late-night cleaning shift, every early morning commute served as a quiet defiance against the challenges life had thrown her way. She couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. Good morning, Mrs. Johnson, came a warm voice, cutting through her reverie as she neared the executive wing. She looked up to see Jack Anderson, a young accountant with a friendly smile. Unlike most employees who barely acknowledged her existence, Jack always greeted her with genuine warmth. It was a small gesture, but one that carried immense weight for Martha. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she replied, her voice warm despite the weariness that often clouded her days. "How are you today?" "I'm well, thank you. And yourself?" "How are the grandkids?" he asked, his eyes reflecting genuine interest. For a moment, the exhaustion that clung to her like a shadow lifted. "They're growing like weeds," she said with a rare smile. "Keeping me on my toes. That's for sure." Jack chuckled, his appreciation evident. "They're lucky to have you. You're an inspiration, Mrs. Johnson." Before Martha could respond, a sharp, cold voice sliced through the air. "Anderson, don't you have work to do instead of wasting time with the help?" Richard Benson, the department manager, approached with his usual air of superiority. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, his sneer unwavering as his gaze shifted from Jack to Martha. Richard was a man who thrived on power, using his position to belittle those he deemed beneath him. To him, Martha was nothing more than a relic, a nuisance, a reminder of an era he was eager to leave behind. Jack straightened immediately, his friendly demeanor replaced by a mask of professional detachment. "Of course, Mr. Benson. I was just heading to my desk." As Jack hurried away, Richard turned his attention to Martha, his tone dripping with disdain. "And you make sure you actually clean properly today. I'm tired of seeing dust in the corners." Martha lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Mr. Benson. I'll do my best." "Best," he scoffed, the word laced with mockery. "Try harder." With that, he strode off, leaving Martha alone in the corridor. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the sting of his words. They weren't new, she had heard them, or worse, countless times before. Still, they never failed to hurt. As she resumed her work, her thoughts wandered back to the early days of her time at Glendale. Back then, the company had been a place of camaraderie and mutual respect. Her colleagues had been friendly, and management had valued her dedication. But times had changed. The old guard had retired, and in their place were individuals like Richard, cold, calculating, and driven by their own insecurities. The sense of belonging she had once felt had eroded, leaving her with a job that was necessary but no longer fulfilling. Unbeknownst to her, someone had been watching. Jack, now seated at his desk, couldn't shake the image of Richard's sneering face and Martha's resigned expression. He had seen similar interactions before: Richard's cruel words, Martha's quiet acceptance, and each one left him with a gnawing sense of guilt. But fear held him back. Richard Benson wasn't just a manager, he was a man with connections. Someone who could ruin careers with a snap of his fingers. If only I had the courage to say something, Jack thought, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. But what good would it do? Richard would find a way to retaliate. And Jack had worked too hard to risk everything. As the hours passed, Martha continued her rounds, her hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Her work, though unappreciated, was her shield, a way to push through the harshness of the world around her. Little did she know, the cracks in that shield were beginning to show. And little did Jack realize, his hesitation to act would soon come to haunt him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Thus began a day that would forever alter the course of their lives and the very fabric of Glendale Industries. Jack Anderson sat at his desk, staring blankly at the spreadsheets on his computer screen. His thoughts were far from the numbers and charts in front of him. Instead, they lingered on the image of Martha Johnson, her shoulders hunched and eyes downcast as she endured Richard Benson's verbal assault. Jack had witnessed it many times before, but today felt different. Today, the cruelty felt sharper, the injustice more glaring. Jack was new to Glendale Industries. Having joined the company straight out of college, he had come with dreams of building a successful career. But it hadn't taken long for the corporate world to reveal its darker side. Richard Benson, the department manager, epitomized everything Jack hated about the culture that had taken root at Glendale. Ruthless, arrogant, and fueled by a need to assert dominance. Richard preyed on those he deemed weak or unimportant. To Richard, Martha was the perfect target. She was older, quiet, and held a position most considered lowly. Her resilience in the face of his bullying only seemed to fuel his contempt. Jack had seen the way Richard's eyes gleamed with a twisted satisfaction every time he found a new way to demean her. And every time, Jack had stayed silent, the fear of retaliation chaining him to his chair. This silence gnawed at Jack's conscience. He prided himself on being a kind and empathetic person, someone who believed in fairness and respect. But when it came to standing up against someone as powerful as Richard, Jack found himself paralyzed. What could he do? Richard was well connected, his influence extending far beyond their office. Speaking out could mean losing his job, derailing his career before it had even begun. Jack's guilt was compounded by his admiration for Martha. Despite everything she had endured, she carried herself with dignity. She didn't complain, didn't lash out. Instead, she simply kept doing her job, her quiet strength shining through the cracks of her weariness. Jack often thought of his own grandmother when he saw Martha. The parallels between them, the sacrifices, the perseverance made it all the more painful to witness her mistreatment. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Richard's voice, sharp and commanding, as it carried through the office. Jack glanced toward Richard's corner office, where the man was pacing, barking orders into his phone. It was a stark reminder of the power imbalance that defined their workplace. Jack clenched his fists, the weight of his inaction pressing down on him. Later that day, Jack crossed paths with Martha in the hallway. Her cart was laden with cleaning supplies, her movements slow but purposeful. She greeted him with her usual warmth, but Jack could see the exhaustion etched into her face. "You're doing okay, Mrs. Johnson?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Martha nodded, offering a small smile. "I'm fine, Mr. Anderson. Just another day." Her response, though simple, carried a quiet strength that humbled Jack. He wanted to say more, to apologize for not standing up for her, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he returned her smile and walked away, his heart heavy. As the day wore on, Jack found himself increasingly restless. The events of the morning replayed in his mind. each memory a sharp reminder of his failure to act. He knew he couldn't continue like this, trapped in a cycle of guilt and inaction. But what could he do? How could he challenge someone like Richard without risking everything? Unbeknownst to Jack, the opportunity to answer those questions was closer than he realized. The events that would unfold in the coming days would force him to confront his fears and decide what kind of person he truly wanted to be. The morning light filtered through the office windows as Martha Johnson pushed her cart down the hallway. The weight of exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter than usual. The sounds of ringing phones and clicking keyboards louder. Each step felt heavier than the last. But she pressed on. Her focus on completing the tasks before her. Her thoughts wandered to her grandchildren. Their laughter. Their energy, it was what kept her going. But today, even the thought of them couldn't lift the fog of weariness that seemed to envelop her. She paused by the wall, leaning against it to catch her breath. The room swayed slightly, and a faint ringing filled her ears. She closed her eyes, willing herself to push through. Just a little longer, she thought. Across the office, Jack Anderson was walking back to his desk, a stack of reports in his arms. He noticed Martha from a distance, her figure unusually still. Something about her posture made him pause. "Mrs. Johnson," he called out, his voice tinged with concern. As he approached, she turned to him with a faint smile. But before she could respond, her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. "Mrs. Johnson." Jack dropped his papers and rushed to her side. Panic surged through him as he gently shook her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open briefly before closing again. "Someone call an ambulance," Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the usual office hum. A crowd began to gather, curious faces peering over cubicle walls. Whispers spread quickly. "What happened? Is she okay?" Some employees stepped forward to help, while others hung back, unsure of what to do. Richard Benson emerged from his office. Irritation etched into his features. "What's all this commotion?" he demanded, his voice sharp. When he saw Martha lying on the floor, his expression hardened. "For heaven's sake," he muttered. "Can't she even manage to stay on her feet? This is exactly why we need younger, more capable staff." Jack looked up at Richard, disbelief and anger flashing in his eyes. "Mr. Benson, she needs medical attention. This is serious." Richard waved a dismissive hand. Fine. Call the ambulance. But make sure she knows not to come back until she's fit for work. We're not running a nursing home here." The callousness of Richard's words hit Jack like a blow. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he struggled to contain his anger. But even as the paramedics arrived and carefully lifted Martha onto a stretcher, Jack remained silent. Fear of Richard's power, of losing his job, kept him rooted in place. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens faded into the distance, a heavy silence fell over the office. Jack returned to his desk, his mind a whirlwind of emotions: anger, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The image of Martha's frail body on the stretcher haunted him. He knew, deep down, that he couldn't ignore what had happened. Something had to change, but he couldn't yet see how to make it happen. Unbeknownst to him, the wheels of change were already in motion, set to challenge everything he thought he knew about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what was right. The atmosphere at Glendale Industries was charged with unease as news of a new CEO spread through the office. Michael Harris was set to take over leadership, replacing the long-serving and largely complacent Charles Jennings. The whispers around the coffee machine painted him as a mystery. Some said he was a strict cost-cutter, others speculated he was a reformer with bold ideas. No one knew what to expect, and that uncertainty was enough to unsettle even the most seasoned employees. Jack Anderson, still shaken from witnessing Martha's collapse, clung to a fragile hope that the arrival of new leadership might signal a shift in the company's toxic culture. Yet he remained cautious. He'd seen firsthand how deep the problems ran, And he doubted one person, no matter how well-intentioned, could fix it all. On the morning of Mr. Harris's first day, Jack arrived early, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who might change the future of Glendale Industries. The office was quiet, save for the hum of computers and the occasional muffled conversation. Jack's heart sank as he passed the supply closet where Martha's cleaning cart was stored, untouched since her collapse. The sight was a stark reminder of the weight of his inaction. As the day unfolded without any grand announcements or appearances from Mr. Harris, the initial buzz of anticipation gave way to confusion. Where was the new CEO? Why hadn't he introduced himself? It wasn't until mid-afternoon that Jack, returning from a coffee run, almost bumped into a casually dressed man near the hallway. The man wore slacks and a polo shirt, an outfit that stood in stark contrast to the formal suits Glendale employees favored. "Excuse me," Jack said, stepping aside. The man smiled warmly. "No problem at all. Say, could you point me toward Richard Benson's office?" Jack hesitated, unsure who the man was. But he pointed down the hall. "Last door on the right. Can't miss it, it's the largest office." "Thanks," the man replied. Then he paused, as if considering something. "Anything I should know about Mr. Benson before I meet him?" Jack's stomach tightened. Should he warn this newcomer about Richard's behavior? What if this man was an ally of Richard's or sent to test employee loyalty? Jack opted for caution. "His, very results-focused," he said carefully. "Runs a tight ship." The man nodded thoughtfully. "I see. Thanks for the tip." A few minutes later, Jack's focus was broken by raised voices coming from Richard's office. Richard's tone, sharp and unmistakably angry, carried through the glass walls. "Who do you think you are? Coming in here dressed like that? Asking questions? This is my department. And I won't have some low-level diversity hire telling me how to run things." The door to Richard's office swung open, and the man Jack had met earlier stepped out. His expression was calm, but his eyes glinted with determination. He turned to address the stunned office. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "we need to have a company-wide meeting. Now." The revelation hit like a lightning bolt. This man, calm, collected, and unassuming, was Michael Harris, the new CEO. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances as Richard paled, the color draining from his face. The once dominant manager suddenly looked small and cornered. Jack felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. Perhaps this new chapter would bring the change they all desperately needed. Little did he know, the coming days would not only test the limits of his courage but also reveal the transformative power of empathy and accountability. The energy in the conference room was electric as employees shuffled in, whispering among themselves. Richard Benson stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by an icy tension. Jack Anderson sat near the middle, his mind racing with questions. Who exactly was Michael Harris? And what kind of leader would he prove to be? When Michael stepped to the front of the room, his demeanor was calm yet commanding. He waited for the murmurs to quiet, his casual attire a stark contrast to the rows of suits before him. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "I had planned to spend my first day observing, learning about how this company operates. But what I've seen in just a few short hours has made it clear that we need to address some serious issues. Now." Jack noticed several employees exchange nervous glances. Richard shifted uncomfortably in the back, but he remained silent. Michael's gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on each employee as if inviting them into the conversation. "Glendale Industries has a proud history, but the culture I've witnessed today falls far short of the values we should stand for. Discrimination, harassment, and abuse of power have no place here or anywhere." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Michael let the moment settle before continuing. "I want to be clear, under my leadership, we will be making changes. Starting tomorrow. We'll implement policies to ensure this workplace is one of respect and inclusion for everyone. I also want to hear from you if you've experienced or witnessed inappropriate behavior. My door is open." As Michael concluded, Jack felt his heart race. Was this his moment? For weeks, he'd been haunted by the memory of Martha's collapse and the cruel tirade she endured in the restroom. He thought of the times he had turned away, choosing self-preservation over standing up for what was right. The guilt that had weighed on him now felt like a call to action. After the meeting, employees trickled out, some hopeful, others skeptical. Jack lingered, his gaze following Michael as he exited the room. Summoning his courage, Jack approached Michael later that afternoon. The CEO greeted him warmly and invited him into a small meeting room. Once the door closed, Jack spoke, his voice trembling at first but growing steadier as he continued. "Mr. Harris, I need to tell you something. It's about Richard Benson and the way he treats employees, especially Martha Johnson. I've witnessed things I should have spoken up about sooner." Michael listened intently, his expression grave. Jack recounted Richard's behavior, describing the verbal abuse, the incident in the restroom, and the lack of empathy shown when Martha collapsed. By the time he finished, Jack felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you for sharing this, Jack," Michael said, his tone resolute. "What you've told me confirms what I suspected. Change starts with honesty, and you've taken an important first step." Jack nodded, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over him. "What happens now?" he asked. Michael's expression was determined. "Now, we act. For Martha. For you. And for everyone else who deserves better." In the days that followed, the changes Michael promised began to take shape. Richard was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, and employees were encouraged to share their experiences in a safe, confidential environment. Jack, inspired by the momentum, found himself stepping into a new role, both as a voice for his colleagues and as someone willing to advocate for fairness. When Michael later asked Jack to lead the newly established Employee Relations Department, Jack hesitated, doubting his own courage. But Michael's words stayed with him. "It's not about what you didn't do before, it's about what you choose to do now." Accepting the position, Jack embarked on a journey of redemption and leadership, determined to ensure that no one at Glendale Industries would ever feel invisible or powerless again. Months passed, and the transformation at Glendale Industries began to take root. Michael Harris's leadership set a new tone, one of accountability, empathy, and inclusion. Policies were revamped. Mandatory diversity and sensitivity training was implemented, and a company-wide commitment to respect was enforced. For the first time in years, employees felt heard and valued. Jack Anderson, now head of the newly established Employee Relations Department, threw himself into his role with passion and determination. Every morning as he walked through the office, he made it a point to greet employees by name, from entry-level staff to senior executives. He wanted to ensure that no one, regardless of their position, ever felt overlooked or undervalued. But the most profound change came in the form of a visit. Michael Harris insisted on personally visiting Martha Johnson in the hospital and asked Jack to join him. Jack felt a mix of apprehension and hope as they entered the small, sterile hospital room. Martha, looking frail but smiling, greeted them warmly. The years of hardship that had etched themselves into her features seemed momentarily softened by the genuine care in her visitor's expressions. "Martha," Michael began, pulling a chair closer to her bedside. "I'm Michael Harris, the new CEO of Glendale Industries. First and foremost, I want to apologize for the way you've been treated, for the culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked, and for not stepping in sooner." Martha's eyes welled with tears, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. That means more than you know." Michael continued, outlining the changes being implemented at the company. Your dedication and resilience haven't gone unnoticed. As a small token of our gratitude, we'd like to offer you an early retirement package with full benefits, ensuring you and your grandchildren are well cared for. The room grew quiet as Martha absorbed his words. Her hands trembled as she reached out to grasp his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given me more than just relief, you've given me dignity." Jack stood to the side, humbled by the moment. For weeks, he had carried the weight of guilt for his silence. But now, seeing Martha's smile, he felt a spark of hope. This was what change looked like, not just policies or procedures, but the restoration of humanity and respect. Back at the office, Jack worked tirelessly to build a culture of trust and openness. One of his first initiatives was a mentorship program, pairing seasoned employees with newer staff. To his surprise and delight, Martha, now retired, agreed to serve as an advisor to the program. She shared her wisdom and experiences, ensuring her voice would continue to shape the company's future. The ripple effects of the changes at Glendale were far-reaching. Employees began to take pride in their workplace, and word of the company's transformation spread. Glendale Industries became a symbol of hope, proving that even the most toxic environments could be reimagined with courage and compassion. For Jack, the journey was deeply personal. He had gone from a silent bystander to a champion for change. And every day, as he walked into the office and saw the renewed energy in his colleagues, he was reminded of the power of standing up for what was right. Martha's story, and the lessons it carried, became a guiding light not just for Glendale but for everyone willing to believe that change was possible.